welcome to today's webinar on teaching tricky books from the Old Testament. I'm Chelsea Erickson, Youth Ministry Editor and Director of Publishing at Rooted, and we just want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. For those of you who are new to Rooted, our mission is to equip and empower churches and parents to faithfully disciple students toward lifelong faith in Jesus Christ. And one of Rooted's 5 pillars of youth ministry is theological depth through expository Bible teaching. We want to lean into that particular pillar today. And we're hoping that this call can both encourage you, but also further equip you to teach the Old Testament in a meaningful way to teenagers that points them to our Savior, Jesus. If you're with us today, as we've already said, if you're with us live, we'd really love to have you introduce yourselves and or share your thoughts and questions in the Q&A feature. We hope to get to address some of these questions toward the end of the call, but please go ahead and share them. You don't have to wait. We may be able to weave them into what we're already planning to talk about. And now I just want to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Each of you has recently written a Bible study curriculum on a book or books from the Old Testament for Rooted. So could you just tell us who you are, where you serve, and which Rooted study you've just written?
Yeah, my name is Kendal Conner. So I serve as the director of Sunday schools at Redeemer Kansas City, so in Kansas City, Missouri. And I just finished writing Ezra and Nehemiah for the restoration package that we have.
My name is Mac Harris. I am in Charlotte, North Carolina at Hope Community Church and working in youth ministry there. And I just wrapped up the Esther curriculum for this package.
And I'm Rebecca Lankford. I am on staff with Rooted as the Ministry Development Coordinator. Prior to that, I worked in youth and young adult ministries, and I wrote the Zechariah curriculum.
Awesome. Well, I'm so thankful to be with each of you and really excited that we get to kind of nerd out on the Old Testament today a little bit. One of my favorite topics. But also, it seems appropriate to mention that each of you is an author in one of Rooted's new books, which is launching this fall, which happens to focus on Old Testament prophecies about Jesus. So we just wanted to give a little shout out to that. It's called Longing for Christmas, 25 Promises Fulfilled in Jesus, and it's an Advent devotional for teenagers. So I'm going to put, I'll share a quick slide about that, along with some other information from Rooted. I'll come back to this slide in a minute and we'll share the other one. Oh, you know what? That may not be the right thing. Well, I'll get it up here as we're talking. I don't have the right thing in front of me, it looks like. Our wonderful Jalen put together a great deck for me, and I'm just technologically challenged. But we're really excited about that book as another way to focus on teaching teenagers the Old Testament. And each of you contributed at least one entry to it. And so I just wanted to mention that that's coming out this fall. It's available now for pre-order through our friends at New Growth Press who published it. And, as much as, we joke about nerding out about the Old Testament, our hope in this conversation really is that all of you joining us and we ourselves would really be able to breathe a deep exhale, a sigh of relief, and that we'd leave this conversation feeling more confident to rightly handle the word of truth, as Paul instructs us in 2 Timothy 2. And I think the reality is that sometimes we can feel quite daunted by this task of teaching the Old Testament and specifically of teaching it in a way that would point our students to Jesus. But just as a reminder, we have God's Spirit living within us to help us understand and apply his word. And we have the gift of one another to share resources and learning and information that can help us be more robust in our teaching to teenagers. So I'm really excited that we can do that together today. And I just want to say to those of you listening, if you're feeling like this is a topic that intimidates you, you're in good company, because sometimes we feel intimidated too. And so we really hope this can be this conversation can be a breath of fresh air for all of us as we lean into this calling that we have to teach the Bible. And I'll pull the slides up I mentioned as we're talking, but just by way of kickoff, like, as Bible teachers, which each of you are, what do you find are some of the trickiest themes to teach on in the Old Testament? And we're going to get more into the books that you've each written on, but just broadly, there are a lot of themes that come up that are hard. lot of questions that teenagers have. So could we just, to use an old school youth group term, could we popcorn it a little bit and just share what some of those might be?
Sure, I can take it. I would say something from this past study that we did in Esther with some kids in our youth group, and then other stuff we've done in the Old Testament. I think just getting into the Old Testament context, getting into the headspace, just feels so far away and feels so foreign. And with Esther, for example, she's a teenage girl, which might be relatable, but she's also becomes the queen of Persia, and most people don't even know what Persia is or what it was. And so, I think just getting us in the right headspace and feeling like each week we have to re-explain and re-situate ourselves. I think that can take just a lot of effort each day. And then just with Esther, for example, at the end, there's the Jewish people kill a lot of God's enemies and get revenge on Haman, and there's a lot of death, and it's kind of difficult to know, hey, what do we do with this? And so, again, that feels like a completely different culture and completely different context than what we're living in, at least in America today.
Yeah. I mean, even going on with that, I would say, like, I think contextually is probably even harder than a lot of the topics, because the Old Testament has essentially to teach something like Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, Esther, all these ones, right? You have to actually understand so much of the context outside of that to get what is going on inside the story. So that can feel overwhelming, right? If we have a 10-week study with students, how do we actually teach them what was happening in the Mosaic law, like beforehand, to get them to where we are today? And how do we explain what happened in the exile to get to the post-exile? Like, all of those factors kind of play in, which make it challenging. And then you also are dealing with the Old Testament laws and understanding what they meant in that time and how that actually applies to the people, because they can feel, I mean, we'll talk about later, but in Ezra and Nehemiah, both, you get the not intermarrying with other nations. And what does that mean? And why is it such a big deal? It seems so unfair in the context. Those kind of things can be really tricky when you're messing with what the laws were and why they were given to the people of God.
Those are all really good points, Mac and Kendall. I think for me, one of the first things that comes to mind when I think about the Old Testament and some intimidating parts of the Old Testament is the theme of God's judgment. Zechariah in particular has just some pretty intense oracles of judgment that God gives against Israel's enemies. And I think for both ourselves and our students, it can be really difficult to square the God of the Old Testament with Jesus in the New Testament. But of course, we want to show students that it's the same God, and that God's his judgment and his justice is an outpouring of his perfect love and holiness. But I think, initially seeing a God who punishes enemies can be a really tricky thing to tackle with students.
Yeah, that's always the first thing that comes to mind. That's so well said. And I think the first thing that comes to mind for me too is always the conquest narratives and things like the flood. Like, we really have to do some work ourselves, I think, to wrap our minds around that, and to be okay with the fact that we're not going to have a perfect answer, that we're probably always going to wrestle with how these things can fit together. But I love the way you just said it, Rebecca, about the outpouring of God's love, is a great thing to take kids back to again and again. So do y'all have, as you think about those things, do you have, some trusted resources that you would recommend, that youth ministers have on their shelves or in their online library or wherever they use resources that they can refer to as they come across a challenging theme or particularly tricky text?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think all three of us have this as one of our resources, but the Bible Project's just a really helpful resource that I think, especially in terms of teaching these texts to students, it gives a very clear timeline. It gives clear understanding of the connectivity of the stories and the narratives from one to the next. So that's a really helpful resource. And it's very driven towards the gospel and towards the Christ connection there. I also really love, there's a ministry called Spoken Gospel that the whole premise of them is to speak the gospel from every corner of scripture and showing Christ in each corner. And so, especially with students, we're trying really hard to bring what these can be really challenging texts to the understanding of how they actually fit into the larger narrative of the gospel. So I really love both of those. As simple and clear. They have videos even that you can give to students to come alongside. And then I use a lot of there's a commentary, kind of more study, really non-technical commentary series. That's the Christ-centered exposition series. And I think that that's a really, for the leader, easy grab to help give some beautiful context to the books.
So that's something that you could give to your lay leaders, you're saying, Kendall?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
that's great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
because sometimes
actually
we
do
have
that.
commentaries, but you're like, is my 6th grade boys
Shoot.
small group leader going to read this on
Right,
a, you know,
correct.
before a Wednesday night?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think going off of that, Bible Project is great. There's a series that Tim Keller's ministry, Gospel and Life, does called Discovering the Gospel in Every Book of the Bible on YouTube. And it's like 12-minute videos of him just giving overviews of each book. And I think that is so helpful because in order for us to teach the book kind of step by step, it's so helpful to understand, hey, what does the whole thing look like? Where's it going? What's the author trying to do? And so that's a great resource. And again, points us forward to Jesus. And a couple other commentaries I think are helpful are the Preaching the Word commentary, which is written by pastors. And a lot of the illustrations are really great in that commentary series. And I think those are so helpful for teachers and for lay leaders or youth ministers, just different ways to connect with students. And I'd say that Dale Ralph Davis also has a number of Old Testament commentaries that are super short and some of the best commentaries I've ever read. So he doesn't do all the Old Testament, but if you can find one with him, it's always a winner.
For me, okay, I want to first, one of my favorite tools ever is Nancy Guthrie's podcast, Help Me Teach the Bible. She has an episode on every book of the Bible where she sits down with an expert on that book and they talk about how to teach that book of the Bible. And the conversations are really engaging and so helpful. And that's usually one of the first places I go is listen to Help Me Teach the Bible. One of the second things I do, it's definitely less academic, and I wouldn't recommend this going in place of a really solid commentary or study Bible. But when I face a text that honestly makes no sense to me and I can't really wrap my mind around it, after I read it in either the ESV or the NIV, one thing I'll do is I'll look it up actually in the Message interpretation, Eugene Peterson's masterpiece, and I'll print it out in the Message version, and I'll just try and really get a sense of like, okay, what is this text actually saying? I found the Message to be just a really, really helpful way to help me understand in more plain terms what's actually going on in the text. And then, of course, once I have a sense of, okay, here's where we are, here's what's going on, I'll turn to commentaries and whatnot. But I found the Message to be a really, really helpful tool in Bible teaching and curriculum writing.
Those are all excellent, y'all. Yeah, I love it. I wanted to mention just one more, and that is, and I'm going to reference it in a minute here as we talk about the historical context of this period that we're going to zero in on today. But one of my professors at Gordon Conwell has written a beautiful, she's designed a beautiful study tool called Casket Empty, and it takes you through the Old Testament with an acronym casket and the New Testament with an acronym empty. And so she's written the Old Testament part. Her colleague, Dr. David Palmer, has written the New Testament part. But the timeline, especially, the book is wonderful. And the timeline is something that you can just pull out again and again when you teach. And it basically gives you, in 6 kind of periods of Old Testament history, it gives you the main nuts and bolts, the main dates, the main people, who are the kings involved, and were they from Judah or Israel? Where does this all, how does this all fit together? So that is one that I just think every youth minister should have at the ready. So helpful, even if you're writing a seminary paper, it's really helpful to reference. But especially as you're teaching teenagers or adults and trying to make these things plain to them, it just helps to situate you in that context. So that's actually what we want to do now is just take a minute before I have our panelists share more in depth about their books and some of the difficulties, frankly, some of the things that might intimidate us a little bit about teaching any one of these books. Before I have them do that, I want to just situate us in the context, the historical moment that we're in as we look at this period of the restoration of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem in the Old Testament. So a couple key dates to remember are, first of all, Jeremiah had prophesied that God's people would be driven out of their land into Babylon for 70 years as a consequence for their sin and rebellion. We read that in Jeremiah 25. But after that time, that God would restore them to the land that he promised to their forefathers. So we have that prophecy in the background of all of this. And then the key dates are that in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel falls when the Assyrians capture the city of Samaria. And then after that, the southern kingdom falls to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in stages. So the first deportation happens in 605 BC, and that's Daniel and his friends. So that's kind of giving you a sense for where we are in the story. The second deportation is in 597 BC. And that's King Jehoiachin and Ezekiel are taken into captivity at that point. And then finally in 586 BC, which is the date that we all kind of, you might have heard before in terms of the beginning of exile, we have the final deportation and the destruction of Jerusalem. And so that is a dark day, a dark time, obviously, for the people of Israel. And there are kind of two key things that I think we need to know in order to understand the period that that our panelists are talking about today. There are kind of two key things we need to know about the beginning of exile. And one is that in this final stage, Nebuchadnezzar not only has he carried off all of the people to Babylon and taken them into captivity, but in this final stage of that sort of the southern kingdom falling, he destroys the temple itself. And he empties it of all of the sacred vessels. And I thought I would just read this to you you can read about this in 2 Kings 25, also in 2 Chronicles 36. And I want to just read these verses for you because I think they help to kind of situate us in this time and to help us think about what the ethos of these Israelites living in exile and then returning to the land actually is. So here's what the chronicler tells us, starting in verse 17. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all of these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So that's the first thing. I mean, you read that and that's just staggering to think about what these people went through and what they had seen. And, the temple was the pride and joy. This is Solomon's temple. It's intricately created according to God's own design, masterfully crafted at great, great expense. It was the jewel of Israel. It was and not only that, but it was the place where God himself dwelt. And so it's hard for us to even imagine sort of the pride and the seriousness, like both religiously and in terms of national identity, that people had in this temple. We think about the events of the Olympics recently when many Christians around the world were so rightly offended by, the opening ceremony. And I mean, and rightly we should be. But you think about this even in similar terms, and yet this is their place where they worship God and where his very presence dwells, and it's just been made a mockery and destroyed. So that's the first thing. But then also from exile in that second deportation, Ezekiel has a vision in chapter 10. So this is before the destruction of the temple. And he prophesies that this destruction will happen. So it's not a surprise. God knows it's going to happen. He allows it. He even ordains it. But even more devastating than the humiliation of having the temple picked apart and its objects carried off into captivity and the people of God carried off, Ezekiel sees the departure of God's own presence from his dwelling place in the midst of the temple. And so this is the most devastating thing about the exile, not just that the temple itself is destroyed and that the people are removed from the place God's given them, the land that he's given them to inhabit, but God's own presence. Ezekiel has this vision of God's own presence departing in a cloud from the temple. And this is just, it's just completely devastating. It's hard for us to even comprehend, but I think this is where we have to get ourselves to understand what's in the mind of any Israelites that were faithful to the Lord, what they would have been feeling. The hopeful part is that in the final chapters of Ezekiel, he envisions a restoration of the temple in which Yahweh's presence will return and a Davidic king will rule forever. And so, and we read, just briefly, and there's so much we could read about this in Ezekiel, but in chapter 43, verse 7, he says, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people Israel forever." And so these are the words and the events that the exiles are anticipating as they return into the land. And we know in 539 BC that happens. The Persian Empire takes control of Babylon, and King Cyrus decrees that the Israelites may return to Jerusalem to rebuild. It's like an incredible act of God. We hear about this a little bit in Ezra. And so that kind of launches this period where we have these 4 books. And again, there's Zechariah, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. We were talking before, they're all a little bit interspersed with each other. It's hard sometimes to disentangle, where they overlap. And but basically, Zechariah happens at the beginning of this period. Esther is somewhere in the middle. Ezra kind of chronicles the whole thing, but the ministries of Ezra and Nehemiah themselves are toward the end. And then the whole period wraps up with Malachi, which I think we've covered in a different curriculum series, right? In the prophets. So that one's in there too. But anyway, we just wanted to give you that kind of broad strokes, like here's what's happening. Just a reminder for all of us. I always have to go back and be like, where am I in this story? And hopefully with that context, everything else that we're going to talk about is just that much more, helps us. But those are the 2 things I think to remember in terms of the temple, the destruction of the temple, and the vision of God's presence, God's very presence leaving. So now turning to you all, thinking about the recent curriculum that each of you has written, what are some aspects of your book, in addition to the context piece that we've already talked about, that just might feel really intimidating as we think about studying it with teenagers? And Rebecca, I wonder if you want to kick us off since you've got Zechariah at the beginning of this whole period.
Yes, this was a super easy question for me to think about because Zechariah's main genre is futuristic prophecy. So actually, especially the first 8 chapters of Zechariah reads a lot like Revelation in terms of it's a detailed narrative of all these visions that Zechariah receives from the Lord. And the visions are really weird. They are not straightforward. And, you've got flying scrolls and women in baskets and winged horses. And so that's definitely a tricky part of studying Zechariah is understanding, okay, what is God trying to communicate through these visions? What is the symbolism here? Obviously God doesn't make mistakes. And so every single thing in these visions is trying to communicate something to us. But it can be really tricky to try and parse those things out. I think especially since the visions come in the front half of the book, it's really easy to just get intimidated and back away. But it's so worth sticking through it because the remaining chapters are so beautiful. They're filled with lots of great promises about the restoration God is going to bring. And the visions themselves too, once you kind of learn to break them down, are really hopeful because they're all ways that God is trying to communicate to his people through Zechariah about what he's going to do to Israel, how he's going to defeat their enemies, what he's going to do to the temple. But definitely those visions can be really tricky to interpret.
I think for Esther, maybe a little bit unlike Zechariah, it reads pretty easily as just a chronological history that's pretty exciting. And so I think just reading and understanding isn't so hard, but I think actually tying it to the gospel, God's name is never mentioned in the whole book, only book of the Bible where that happens. And so I think students might get a baseline understanding of what's going on, but kind of the next step can take a little bit more work and can take a little bit more digging for students to do, which is a fun challenge and kind of encouraging them to do that. But Yeah, I'd say that's one difficulty. And another one, I just think that Esther is not a very PG book of the Bible. Maybe second to Judges. It is one of the more explicit ones. And I think the narrator leaves a lot ambiguous. He doesn't really, or the author, I should say, doesn't really make moral judgments one way or the other. And so we have Esther and Mordecai are the two main characters, but we don't really know, is God approving of their actions? Is he disapproving of their actions? We don't really know what we should make of them ourselves. And so I think for us, it's tempting to want to read the Old Testament, especially, and say, okay, how is this person a good role model or a bad role model? And I think for kids, that's the temptation. And Esther and Mordecai don't really let us do that, which is a good thing. But it's a lot more work on our end to say, hey, these are complicated people. These are real humans operating in a gray area. And that's what life is like today. And things aren't always black and white. And so that's a good entry point into application, but it does make it harder to actually understand, hey, what are we to make of these two heroes in this story?
Yeah, that's so good. I think that that's in a lot of ways similar with Ezra and Nehemiah, is that you have a narrative and you have a story that's fairly easy to read. I will say Ezra, there's some complications of how the author put the book together, and there's letters that are thrown in at different times that actually go with another time period. But I think the harder parts of those two, if I would name one, is that, man, especially with students, we want a really neat bow kind of tied up in the story to like proclaim the gospel that like God did what he promised. Like this is it. And Ezra and Nehemiah both are really well known for being stories that kind of have anticlimactic endings. Like there is not a beautiful resolve in what the story comes to. So I think that's one of the tricky parts, is understanding, but it's also what I think is the beautiful part of these stories, is it's really personal to how we experience our faith oftentimes, and how our students experience it, is that we know the promises of God, we see him working, but we haven't seen the finality of the conclusion of what God has promised. And so there's those realities. Also, Ezra and Nehemiah are dealing greatly with like, man, this is the time period where the exiles are returning back in. We have multiple different returns. You actually have three main characters, with Zerubbabel, Ezra, and then Nehemiah coming in to do different aspects of this restoration of the city of Jerusalem. However, you also see them struggling with what it means to come back into the law of God, like what it means to come back into the presence of God. And so you have a moment where, Ezra decrees essentially divorce among these other nations. And you're ending the book of Ezra with the women and children actually being like taken out of the people of God who had been married in, decreed to divorce them. And so you're dealing with these like laws that are coming from Old Testament, and how it's actually getting implied as they're coming back into the story. And so there's a lot of just, again, having to explain and understand the purpose of those laws, the purpose of not intermarrying, the purpose of the nations that are surrounding all those things, and why God would initiate those laws, and maybe how Ezra and Nehemiah even like misapplied those laws. You're having to deal with both of those realities in the book.
Yeah, and I mean, just as you're talking, that's like so everything y'all have said just resonates so much. I hope it's helpful to you all listening. I think it has to be just really good. But yeah, it makes us long for Jesus, doesn't it? I mean, what you're saying, particularly Kendall, about the anticlimactic nature of things. It's like if we could wrap it up with a neat bow, then we're tempted to just do that.
Yeah.
Just like what you said, Mac, about the characters not really letting us, and their narrator not really letting us say, oh, look how good these people were. But it's like in all these stories, we long for Jesus and we get to proclaim him. So yeah, really well said. So, I mean, just thinking about how easy it is to be intimidated by teaching these Old Testament books, and particularly the ones that you all are talking about and have just written studies on. What are some of the resources, or maybe some of the interpretive keys in your respective book that helped you break through that and see the hope of, I think each of you would say, yes, you should teach this book to teenagers. So what helped you to get there as you were writing, and I'm sure sometimes scratching your head, like, well, how do we get through this? What were the things that God used to help you?
Well, Chelsea, you alluded to this really well when you were giving your spiel of the restoration period, but I think one thing that was really helpful for me in studying Zechariah is interacting with the other Old Testament prophets. Haggai, in particular, they were contemporaries, Haggai and Zechariah, and they both had a mission of spurring God's people on to rebuild the temple. Looking at Zechariah in tandem with Haggai is really helpful. But then also, as you were alluding to, Chelsea, I think it's really important to understand what promises had already been made to God's people. Promises like you read about in Jeremiah and Isaiah about how God's going to bring his people back into the land and that there's going to be prosperity and blessing. The temple restoration that you alluded to, they had all these promises made to them. And so you have to imagine that when they get back to Jerusalem and the temple's in shambles, crops are failing, they're under Persian lordship, it had felt like God had really abandoned his promises. All that to say, I found it really helpful to interact with what the prophets had said to Israel, what they had said about the future of Israel. That really kind of helped me put the puzzle pieces together with Zechariah. You also alluded to this, but I think this could be said of any book in the Bible, but Zechariah in particular, I think it's really important to have a good understanding of the biblical theology of the temple and just that whole theme that we see running throughout scripture. I know in all of our books, probably Kendal and mine's especially, the temple is central because Israel is working to rebuild the temple. And Chelsea, you helped us see why that was such an important task, because it's where God was said to dwell. So no temple meant no relationship with God. I think that's really important to have a grounding of the temple that we see all the way back in Eden, and then the temple all the way forward in Revelation. Keeping that in mind, I think is really helpful with a book like Zechariah that's so focused around the physical temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah, so helping
Yeah,
students, in other words, translate how like what the new temple is, right? That it's not a physical,
Exactly. Yes.
guess what? The second temple's destroyed in 70 AD, like you said, but we have a
Right. And
temple and
yes, I
it's,
mean, another
yeah,
way that it makes us long for Jesus, like you just said.
amen.
yeah. I think Rebecca, to your point of placing it within the context of the Old Testament, I think that's always going to be helpful. I think for Esther, you can kind of understand the book, what's happening without the greater context, but it's hard to understand why this is in the Bible and why God is letting all of this happen without knowing the bigger story, what's going on, especially at the end, connecting, oh, this is actually the end of a holy war that started generations earlier, and kind of being able to take students back to Exodus and say, hey, this is actually Exodus and First Samuel, and see this is actually a through line that God has been he's completing here, and this isn't just a random one-off act of random violence. I think another piece for Esther especially, it builds, and so I think at the beginning you're wondering, what does this Persian king who is feasting and misogynist and you don't really know what's going on, you're kind of wondering, okay, where is God? What's he up to? And it takes a few chapters to get into it a little bit. And I think that's where, as a teacher, reading the whole book at the beginning and understanding big picture, where are we building towards, is helpful. But even just kind of giving your kids something to hold on to of, hey, at the beginning, it's okay for us to be a little confused and for us to kind of be reading this like, curious of where God is and what he's up to, because we see as Esther kind of develops as a character that she becomes, she evolves. And the Esther we meet in chapter 2, who is very passive and gets acted upon and doesn't really have a lot of control in her life, is very different from the Esther of chapter 5 and 6 and 7. And so I think seeing the ways that she develops as a character are really helpful in seeing the ways, okay, Esther in chapter 7, chapter 8 is pointing us forward to something beyond herself. Whereas Esther in chapter 2 is someone that maybe we can relate to, because we are also, being acted upon by forces outside of ourselves, and we are having identity crises of our own. And so I think being able to stick with characters throughout the whole story is really helpful for students to kind of see that development.
Yeah. Yeah. I will just echo in all of this. The reality is with these books in particular is like, I actually put this in, I believe it was the Ezra study, but essentially like to helping students understand the difference between the canonical and the chronological order of the books of the Bible, because you really do have to understand the context of the larger narrative, which is why I love the Old Testament, because it forces you, you've got to know the story of God, the fullness of God, and what he's doing among his people to understand why these things are taking place or going the way that they're going now. Like with Ezra and Nehemiah, you're entering into, like, I'll just use this as an example. So when I taught Nehemiah, I actually spent the very first week doing, this is going to sound cheesy, we work with students, but I did a eras tour of Israel, and I literally walked through the different time periods and spent the whole first one just setting up, nothing to do with the book, but just to do with the history of Israel. And what God is doing, because then that would allow me, as I'm teaching, to jump back and be like, remember, and I gave them the eras different names. I'm like, remember this era, this is what's going on in this era. That actually helps us to understand what's happening in our current time.
That's awesome, Kendal.
Yeah, it was, the girls loved it. But we did, so even with that, because like one of the hardest parts again of Ezra and Nehemiah both, but particularly Ezra, is this understanding of how God could allow like this decree for the divorce to send off the women and the children who had intermarried, or to tell the people that they couldn't, that they couldn't be with the other nations in this particular time. And it can seem really harsh in understanding, but when you look at the larger narrative of scripture, you're like, okay, this is actually the beauty, right? Where we get to have these tension points. So the decree that Ezra is bringing back, because he's a master of the law, is a decree from Deuteronomy that says, like, particularly specifies you can't marry a Moabite or an Amorite, right? So you can't have either one of these. Well, we have an issue with that, because if you look at other stories in the New Testament, Ruth is a Moabite woman, and she is in the lineage, right? Like, she is a part of the lineage that we see for Christ. She's brought into the family, particularly listed that she's brought into the assembly of Israel, yet Deuteronomy says you can't bring them into the assembly. Same with Rahab. Like, you get these narratives, you're like, okay, there's a tension here. So the only way to resolve the tension, Ezra and Nehemiah, is to know that there is a tension to begin with. And that allows you to look into, okay, there's got to be something different than just this law to not intermarry with other nations. It's really that the law is about not like the nationality, but it's about purity of worship, right? Because you see in other stories in the Old Testament from the time of like Joshua essentially on, and what led to the exile in the first place is intermarrying with other nations that brought gods into false gods into the worship of the one true God. And so because of that, that's actually what led to the exile in the first place. And so now you're starting to get these pieces that, like, man, God has always given provision for the outsider. He's always made laws even that provided for the exile, the alien, all of that. So this law that we're seeing here, there has to be something deeper. And then that allows you to talk about, it's about the temple. It's about the worship of God, the temple that we're rebuilding, that theology of the temple we talked about from the start. That is where the core is for the purity of the worship. And it allows us to understand and see who God is in a bigger way. So I think that that's like really the only thing that helped me get through these books, is like, I had to find a way to show the larger narrative of the Old Testament to make sense of anything else.
I would love to see your lesson plan for the eras. That's so fun. I
Me
feel like
too.
that's something people could take and like actually do with their youth groups, to make this come alive. And yeah, we have a question about that we'll get to, about how do you help kids want to study these things. So we'll make sure to circle back to that. We see you. That's a great question. I did want to follow up on something, and Mac, I hope I'm not putting you too much on the spot here with this, but I wanted to follow up because I think that you've taught Esther with a group of guys, right?
I did, yes.
Can you just tell us, like, just really practically, how did you talk about some of those more PG, not PG, not PG themes with them
Yeah,
in a way that's like appropriate but real? Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
Like, I think that's a
yeah.
question that sometimes we have when we come to some of these topics. It's like, okay, we know that teenagers want to be taken seriously. We know that they're consuming content that's not PG, a lot of them.
Mm.
And yet we want to handle God's word really seriously. So how did you balance all of that with Esther?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'll say, and this is maybe connected with this question a little bit, is I think maybe the Eras Tour is a great way to get girls and maybe some guys involved and invested in history. But I think that a lot of our guys at least love to know like what are the Babylonian torture instruments and like what did the Ninevites do to their enemies and why did that make Jonah so afraid? And yeah, I think that like the Judges was it was an awesome book of the Bible to study with them because they like loved the gore and the violence and that kind of thing. And I think that the non-PG-ness of the Bible can be a real entry point because it is kind of appealing. It almost feels like, am I supposed to be reading this? Like, is that actually what it's saying? And so I studied it with some eighth and ninth grade guys, and so they were a little bit more mature than say some sixth or seventh graders probably could have been, and I probably would have handled it differently. But we read it, and I kind of asked them, "Hey, what do y'all think is going on here?" And they kind of stumbled into the answer a little bit, and then their phrase became the sleepover party is was how they kept describing it. And so I kind of let them come up with the language to describe it, even as we were aware of what we were actually talking about and kind of the moral ambiguity of what Esther had done and kind of, oh, this is actually was so risky and maybe right, maybe wrong. We don't really know. And kind of let that language that they were comfortable using kind of drive the conversation, even though it was aware that we were all on the same page.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Yeah, because I think our teenagers are, they're so aware of like the social justice element of these stories and want to talk about that. And so I feel like we can be really strong in calling that out. Like, what the king was doing was absolutely not okay, and we can call that out and draw parallels to today. But yeah, I think that piece that you just talked about, that's a little harder sometimes to know how to nuance. So I love that idea of letting them kind of direct the language that you use. And
Yeah, and I can't remember. Some of them had seen the VeggieTales
yeah.
event of Esther, and I can't remember exactly what the way that is framed as, but that whatever the VeggieTales wording came up several
I was
times as
going to
well. But
ask if you had that one come in there because that's yeah,
That is so
we did
often the
watch it at the
framework,
end.
isn't it?
Yes,
That's so
that
often
was
the
like our
framework.
culmination. We watched it, lesson 9.
That's great. Hey, and that's a really, we had a Bible teacher in our sixth grade Sunday school class in my most recent church, phenomenal teacher, had developed this curriculum that she took kids through every year. And part of it was learning how to teach the Bible or learning how to read the Bible. And they studied the book of Jonah. And on one Sunday, they watched VeggieTales and they had their little notepads and they would take some notes about what was different from the actual story. And that's a great way of
Smart.
helping them wrap their
Yeah,
head around, okay, this is kind of the cleaned up, sanitized version, cartoon. It's supposed to be fun and cute, but here's what the Bible's actually telling us happened. And we need to kind of like, okay, we learned that growing up. We watched those movies for better or for worse, but we need to look at what the Bible's actually saying. So I think that's a great tool, a great teaching tool with Esther and any of the other books that may have that feature if your kids are familiar with it, or even if they're not. Um, Okay, well, I do really want to get to this this other question that I think y'all are going to have really insightful thoughts on. An anonymous viewer with us asks about, just I think this reality that we're all familiar with. Some kids have a hard time being interested in connecting with the historical context or even the significance of God's temple in Jerusalem. Yes, been there. Totally agree with this. Let alone connecting that to Jesus. So, what are some things that you found helpful? And just urging kids to grow in enthusiasm for understanding the Bible, its history, its context, and also to make their own connection to relationships with God. That's a great question. Love to hear what you'd all say.
This is a really good question. And yeah, I think all of us who have been in youth ministry, we hear you. I mean, such a real thing. And, there's one sense in which I don't blame them. It can be really hard when you are a middle schooler living in the United States of America in 2024 to think, well, what on earth does this ancient temple in Israel have to do with my life? One of the things that came to mind as I was reading that question is just maybe the importance of reminding students that God is writing one big story, and we are part of that story. Israel's story is our story. They are our spiritual ancestors, and God, in His mercy, has included us in that grand narrative. And that's an exciting thing to think about, that from the beginning of time until Jesus comes back, and then all into eternity. That's the story that we are written into. It's not something that is divorced from our lives, even though sometimes it can feel like, even though the contexts are so different. But yeah, that's one thing that I was just thinking of, reminding them that we are involved. We are written into the grand narrative that God is writing for His people. And that's a really exciting thing. And then bringing in Taylor Swift as often as possible. I think that can never hurt.
Or Syrian warfare with boys.
Right.
Yeah.
Or Travis Kelce, maybe.
Or nowadays in Kansas City, it hits real hard. Yeah. I mean, I would even say with that, one of the things I was thinking is just, I completely agree with Rebecca. And then one of the things that getting even more practical and just some tools, like if I'm trying to teach this with middle schoolers, I'm actually using very physical means to help them kind of grasp what's going on. So I might even have them drawing part of the story. I might have them if I'm giving them the timeline, like having them write it out and then playing kind of like a puzzle piece matching game, ways that are helping them like not just hear and receive, because when you hear it, it just sounds like a history lesson, right? Which it is. But then what are some ways that you can actually get them putting the pieces together? So even when I think of like the biblical theology parts, for my high schoolers, love having them actually draw the conclusions themselves, because students will get excited if they feel like they're the ones that found it in the scripture, right? So if I'm having them reading this text about the law, then I might have one of them open up to the text in Deuteronomy and listen and read that part. And then I might have somebody open up to the text in Ruth and read this part and be like, what are you guys seeing here? What is happening in this? Having them draw out the conclusion without just laying it out for them. And then connecting it to their real lives. Like the reality is in these, like you have the longing for the temple, just like Chelsea named Malachi comes at the end. I actually wrote that curriculum and like love how it ends, because it ends with us literally being like, what happens next? Like, I don't know. What is God going to do? Like we have this time period, and helping to relate those aspects of, man, haven't you ever felt like, I just don't know if God's actually going to come through? Like, have you ever felt like you don't know if God's promises can actually be fulfilled, and helping them physically see those things? So I hope that's kind of helpful, of like getting very tangible to get them excited with the Old Testament, instead of just giving it all to them, finding ways to get them to kind of do the digging themselves makes it a little bit more exciting.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think one thing, just the theme of exile being a common one for all of these books, and it's different what Old Testament as exile was for Israel and the reasons why. But exiles is a word that Peter uses to describe us in the New Testament. And to be an exile in this world is something that students, if they're not familiar with yet, they are becoming familiar with it as they are in high school and public school and private Christian schools. They are experiencing what it is like to live in a world that doesn't always follow Jesus. And so I think that there are connection points that we can make of, hey, this is the context and this is what it was like for them, but this actually might be more similar and more familiar to us than we realize. And so what exile or identity is a big thing for Esther as she's wrestling with, am I going to be a Jewish woman, or am I going to be the Queen of Persia? And that's something that all teenagers are wrestling with, is who am I, and who are my friends, who am I following, that kind of thing. And so it does feel far away at first glance, but I do think that all these books have really tangible things that are connecting and applying to students' lives today.
Yeah, those are all such great ideas. Just as you're saying that, Mac, I'm thinking, I grew up in a church that really taught the Bible and was really serious about making sure we knew at least the stories. But I didn't have the vocabulary of exile until I was much older. And I do think that's a really powerful tie-in. The only thing I would add to what you all have said is just, I think relationships are obviously one of students' biggest needs. And I think that sometimes if we can really meet that need in our youth ministry, which of course we're called to do as the people of God, it really does it opens up an audience with teenagers to talk to them about things that they might not think they care about, you know, and just gives us at least enough time to show them some of those connections that you all are saying. So, and I think the other need they have, especially high schoolers, but middle schoolers too, at some level, is to be taken seriously. So I think if we can do those two things and really be just proactive and serious about relationships and even having fun together, that opens the door for the serious conversations in small group. And when we demonstrate that we take them seriously, sometimes they do begin to care about things that they didn't think they would care about, you know, just because the relationship is there and they see that the adults in the room, the other students in the room care what they have to say and care to talk about something important. So hopefully that's helpful. Love to hear if those of you who are with us today have other ideas. We would love to hear your brainstorming on that too, because we're all always growing as teachers, and I'm sure there are in this collective group even more ideas that could help us. I wanted to circle back to one more question we had planned, and then we'd be glad to answer a few more from those of you listening if you have questions for our panelists. But the last thing I really wanted to ask about was, you know, what are some, and we've talked about this throughout, but if you could just name a couple for us, what are some of the most exciting gospel connections in each of your respective studies? You know, as you went through these books, what were the things that just made your heart thrill that you thought, I want teenagers to hear this? If you could share some of those, that would be really encouraging.
Yeah, Zechariah really surprised me with this one in a good way. A fun fact I learned is that second to the Psalms, Zechariah is the most quoted Old Testament book during the Passion narratives. So it was obviously a super important book to Jesus. And I just thought that was cool. Who knew that there were so many Old Testament allusions from Zechariah in the Passion narratives? But back to this question about gospel connections, I think one of the best scenes in Zechariah is happens in chapter 3. And for anyone that's about to teach the Bible, keep this in your back pocket as a really helpful picture of justification and imputed righteousness. It's a scene where Joshua, the high priest, this is one of Zechariah's visions. Zechariah gets a vision of Joshua, the high priest, being brought before Satan, who is accusing him. And Joshua is standing in filthy rags. And an angel of the Lord comes and removes Joshua's filthy rags and replaces them with robes of white. So it just really cannot be a clear picture of what's going on there, that Joshua's sins being taken away from him in the presence of the accuser, and he's being clothed in the righteousness of Christ. It's such a beautiful picture, and one that really captures the heart of the gospel. And it obviously points us to what Jesus has done for us. A couple of others that come to mind, Zechariah 9 is where we get that prophecy of the coming King of Zion that's coming in to save his people, humble on a donkey, which then, of course, Jesus fulfills the week of his death when he rides into Jerusalem to die on a donkey to come and save Israel. There are also lots of allusions to this Davidic branch that's going to come and that will also redeem and restore Israel. And of course, we learn later in the New Testament that Jesus is that branch from the root of Jesse that comes and through his life, death, and resurrection saves Israel and defeats their enemies. So there are lots more, but those are a few of my favorite gospel connections we see in Zechariah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I would say part of me wishes that Esther was as explicit as Zechariah sometimes, but I think that also adds to the fun of God isn't mentioned. And so we as readers and our students get to kind of have a challenge of, okay, where is God behind the scenes? And God's sovereignty in the shadows is a huge theme all throughout Esther. I do think that the Sally Lloyd-Jones and the intro to the Storybook Bible, the Jesus Storybook Bible, it kind of explains it really well about the whole Bible. She says that the Bible is most of all a story. It's an adventure story about a young hero who comes from a far country to win back his lost treasure. It's a love story about a brave prince who leaves his palace, his throne, everything to rescue the ones that he loves. And she's talking about Jesus there, but I also think that's really what Esther is forced to do. Is she's forced to wrestle with, am I going to risk this palace? I'm going to risk being the queen of this huge empire to save God's people. And so she, like Jesus, is given this dilemma of, do I risk my own life? Do I risk everything to save God's people? And then she also kind of points us forward to Jesus, and that she's interceding before the king on behalf of the people. And so there are some really clear ways where Esther is a type of Christ. Esther is pointing us forward beyond herself, even as she's a murky character, but to pointing us forward towards the perfection of the person of Jesus.
Man, that was really well said. I love that. Yeah, I would say for Ezra and Nehemiah, you have this. So combining these two books, because they were originally like one narrative, and they're telling this whole post-exilic like return to Jerusalem. But the whole book in general, there's so many little things. Like you literally start Ezra with the words, God stirred the heart of the king of Persia in order to fulfill the words of Jeremiah. And like you see God's sovereignty over kings and kingdoms and his promise to fulfill that he is faithful. You see really clear pictures of that. But I think the entire books, like both of these books, the entirety of the story, it creates in us like there's not these necessarily clear like precursors to Christ. It just creates us this deep longing for Christ, because these books are all about the temple and the return of the temple and the return of worship, which, as Chelsea and like Rebecca both named early on, was where the presence of God dwelled with his people. It was how they had this relationship with their God, and they had spent now, decades in exile away from that. They're returning back, and you see like Ezra, Zerubbabel rebuilding the foundation of the temple and trying to get the temple rebuilt. And there's this moment in Ezra 6 where the foundation is laid, and there's imagery in this that reminds us of when the first temple was built. And we see this weird, interesting juxtaposition of like the people who were not a part of the original temple, the younger exiles, rejoicing because they're like, man, the temple's getting rebuilt. And then you see the older ones weeping. So there's this mixture where there's weeping and rejoicing at the same time, because the presence of God didn't return the way that it had fallen on the temple the first time. And so you're like, man, I thought that's what we needed to do. God's presence in return. And so then Ezra comes and brings back the word and brings back the law. And it's like there's this kind of revival, but God's presence still hadn't returned. And so then we see, the word come to Nehemiah. Nehemiah hears it and is weeping because he's so sad that the presence hasn't returned back to Jerusalem, that God wasn't dwelling there yet. So then he returns and rebuilds the wall and tries to bring back this revival. And you see all these efforts of the people to bring the presence of God back, to dwell among them. And what better gospel pictures, like that's how much we long. And it's not about our actions. Obedience matters, and the things that we're doing to restore the revival of our hearts matter. But there was only going to be one return that would, like a temple that would never fall, a temple that would never crumble, a temple that couldn't be overtaken by our enemies, a temple that when was destroyed was rebuilt in 3 days, right? That is Christ. The longing of these books is fulfilled fully and wholly in Christ, and not until then, because we're left with that anticlimactic, like, man, God's promises, he's obviously working. It says the mighty hand of God like 8 times in Ezra alone, talking about his work. But we're still wanting something. And like your students and you are going to leave the book wanting something more. And it's the fulfillment that's only going to come when we enter back into the story in the New Testament. So I think that's to me, there's so many little ones, but that's what it's longing, is the presence of God to return, which comes in Christ. So yeah.
So beautifully said. Yeah, it does leave us wanting more. As I was reviewing the historical context, I was reminded too of the figures of Joshua, who Rebecca, you mentioned, and then Zerubbabel, and how they each are, Joshua in the line of the high priest, and then Zerubbabel in the line, he's a grandson of Jehoiachin. And so they're representing the priestly and the Davidic kingly lines. And those two are going to be fulfilled in Jesus. They're going to be brought together in one person. So yeah, it's just so powerful. And yeah, I think if we only ever teach the New Testament, our teenagers are really going to miss this richness of the story. And that's a lot of I think happens a lot, just because we feel comfortable there. So we really hope and pray that this time together today is helping you to feel more confident that that this is good work, that God has given you what you need through his Son and his Spirit to do it, and hopefully put you among friends. We hope you feel you've been among friends today with resources to share as well.